My Hero Academia, All Grown Up. Chapter 28. The Mamushi group is in disarray. Tenya Ida's voice was commanding as he stood at the front of the dark conference room. A projection of the Mamushi group known associates lit up the white wall behind him. Take Constrictor, for example. He pointed to the face of the villain with an X through it. He was the guy that did all of Viper's dirty work until he decided to try and break off from the group. It left a huge void that hasn't been filled, so nobody is holding the lower-level villains accountable or giving them any direction. Bakugou sniffed and leaned back in his seat. So what then? We just pick off the little guys until Viper is all alone. No. Ida shook his head and clicked to the next slide. This guy's the one we need to be looking for. Uraraka blinked at the image on the projection and couldn't help but feel like the villain looked rather ordinary. Short black hair, circular glasses, and he was wearing a suit. For fuck's sake, Bakugou grunted and threw his head back. Every person in this fucking city looks exactly like that. You even look like that. How the hell are we supposed to find a needle in a stack of needles, dumbass? Ground Zero. Edshot's tone was firm as he made himself known. He had slipped into the room unnoticed. That's not how we treat our consultants at the Edshot agency. Bakugou scoffed but bit his tongue. We'd have better luck turning over every stone, hoping that Viper's hiding underneath one. Ida didn't acknowledge Bakugou's attitude, deciding to simply carry on with his brief. We only know him as the teller. He's been underground for several years as the Mamushi accountant, but recently he's shown an affinity for violence. Uraraka had to look away as crime scene images were shown. They were gruesome, and it made her skin crawl. The victims were known villains, and they were completely covered in tiny cuts. The autopsy photos showed that even their eyes had suffered from multitudes of lacerations. They had been sheared to death, and there was no shortage of victims. The scenes themselves looked disheveled. It appeared that the perpetrator had emptied out the entire area in a hurry. Only a few scraps of paper and open drawers were left behind alongside the bodies. How do you know that this teller guy is the one that did that? Bakugou grunted, his attention never diverted. Ida clicked through to a photo of Teller's face again. The teller's quirk is unique. We have strong reason to believe that he is making a move to claim Constrictor's open spot. He glanced back at the image behind him. He's the one that reopened the quirking drug supply lines, and this isn't the first time he's tried to do it. There were always rumors of tension between him and Constrictor. Do you have any leads? Edshot's voice cut in before Bakugou could pipe up again. Ida cleared his throat and shook his head. It's reasonable to assume that Teller has relocated himself in Tokyo. It's the largest market for quirking drugs, but it's also where Viper's biggest problems are. Someone needs to be local to deal with them, and Viper's bounty is too high to remain here. This manhunt will have to be pretty grassroots. I'm not interested in catching this Teller guy. Bakugou's tone was annoyed as he gave Ida a stern look. We need to be chasing Viper down. If we can cut the head off of the snake, the whole damn thing will die. Capturing Teller may be the key. Ida straightened his tie and held Bakugou's stare. He could give us the information we need to find Viper. Except when another teller comes along and takes his place, Bakugou shrugged. And that's assuming that he tells us anything at all. The Mamushi group breeds loyalty. They just went through a civil war. Ida cut back with a firm tone. That doesn't sound like loyalty to me. Bakugou chuckled darkly at Ida's pressured tone. Do you have any new information about Viper, or did you just come here to tell us to move on? Uraraka felt the tension in the room and timidly put up her hand. I have a question, actually. All the eyes in the room turned on her, and she smiled despite the attention. Ida's face seemed to soften up a touch as he acknowledged her with a short nod. Of course. Go ahead. This Teller guy, she glanced at the image. What does he stand to gain by taking Constrictor's place? She cocked her head thoughtfully. If he handled the Mamushi finances up to this point, then I'm sure money isn't what he's after. And judging by the little history we have on him, it's clear he's not interested in power. The room paused to consider the question, but Ida was the one who spoke up. That is a really good question, Uravity. He glanced back at the picture of Teller's face. I'm afraid we don't know enough about him yet to answer that. Uraraka reluctantly recalled the images of the crime scenes. He seems angry about something. Like what? Edshot replied as he gave her his full attention. She shrugged and continued to look at the photograph. I don't know, but whatever it is, it made him go overboard during his killing spree. She signaled to Ida to scroll back to the autopsy photos. Doesn't it seem like there's more to it than just reorganizing the network? He's sending a message. Here's your message. Don't fuck with Viper. Bakugou cut in when she was finished. It makes sense after Civil War. Uraraka skewed her mouth thoughtfully. Maybe, but it still doesn't feel like it adds up. The room was silent for a few seconds before Edshot slowly made his way to the front to stand beside Ida. I think this was a productive brief. He turned his attention back on the brunette. I like Uravity's direction. Motive could give us a better look inside the current changes in the Mamushi group's activities. He glanced at the blonde hero that was seated toward the front. I'd like you working with her on this. When Red Riot returns to work, loop him in as well. However, in the meantime, I would like for you two to be our leads on the Viper case. Uraraka felt a wash of nervous energy at Edshot's orders. She hadn't put much thought into working with Bakugou again, nonetheless a temporary partnership on a national case. She gulped at the prospect but reminded herself that despite her issues with the blonde, the job came first. Edshot Bakugou began with a sharp shake of his head. It wasn't a request. The owner of the agency's tone turned stern. He glanced back at Uraraka and gave her a stoic look. Welcome back, Uravity. She blinked at him for a moment before nodding. Thank you, sir. Edshot nodded at each of them before he shook hands with Ida and left. The room felt tense upon his exit, and Uraraka cleared her throat as she moved to get up. She allowed herself to look at Bakugou for a few seconds and realized that he hadn't budged from his seat. He simply glared down at the tabletop. It's nice to see you in costume again. Ida meandered across the room toward the brunette. Uraraka turned her gaze to her old high school class rep. I miss seeing you in yours, Ingenium. He shrugged and glanced back at the projection. I miss it too sometimes, but I don't miss the pressure for a spotlight. It got in the way of my goals. He tucked his hands into his blazer. I like this job. It's modest, but it's honest. I feel like I'm making a difference. Uraraka smiled at him. I think you're doing a good job. You seem happy. For fuck's sake. Bakugou growled mostly to himself as he shoved himself out of his chair and slouched his way toward the door. When he got to the threshold, he gave Uraraka a quick glance, pausing long enough for her to catch it before he exited. Uraraka sighed audibly and resisted the urge to shake her head as she gathered up her notes from the meeting and tucked them under her arm. You seem stressed, Ida said suddenly, his eyes glazing over her side profile. The brunette caught herself before she sighed again, and she gave Ida a soft look. I'm fine. It's only my second day back at work, so I'm just trying to get back into the swing of things again. Are you sure? He cocked his head and shifted his weight on his feet. She nodded at him and gave him a reluctant smile. Yeah, I'm all right. Thank you for asking. Uraraka, he said her name with a firmer tone. You've been through a lot, and we've been friends for many years. If you need anyone to talk to, you know I'm here, right? She felt her lip quiver at his kind words. Thanks, Ida. How are things? He pressed a little harder as she adjusted the papers in her hands. They're fine, she replied with a soft breath as she glanced around the room. I'm just trying to get used to all of this, you know? It's a lot of change. He smiled encouragingly at her. All good change, I hope. Yeah. She felt a small but genuine smile grace her lips in response. It's been a little weird, but I'm taking it one step at a time. I just wish everyone would stop asking me about Deku. Ida nodded and glanced down at his shoes. Well, there goes my next question. Uraraka giggled with him, knowing that he was still partially asking her. I honestly don't know what's going on with him. We haven't talked, but I feel better leaving it like that. I guess I was afraid that it would get blown out of proportion, but Deku never really was that sort of guy anyway. I talked to him over the weekend. Ida shrugged and tried to gauge her reaction. He's doing better. The Americans are keeping him busy, and I think that it's helping. Good, she replied softly and looked away. Listen, Ida. You don't have to say it. He shook his head at her. I won't ask again. He reached out to place a hand on her shoulder. If you need anything, don't be afraid to ask. Thanks. She smiled at him before she slowly stepped around him to head for the door. He watched after her before speaking up one last time. Oh, Uraraka, one more thing. He looked her in the eyes when she turned her head back toward him. Don't be afraid to move on, okay? She felt her mouth dry out, but she nodded slowly in acknowledgement. He simply mirrored the movement before he moved to gather his things, and she stepped out into the hallway. She didn't dare give him another glance before she began wandering toward her office. She passed a closed door and paused for a brief moment, remembering how the meeting had ended. She and Bakugou were partners on the Viper case now. Maybe that moment wasn't the ideal time to talk to him, but for the sake of their work, they'd have to figure it out soon. She chewed her lip for a moment as she considered opening the door, but ended up deciding to continue walking. It wasn't quite the right time yet. Bakugou wasn't sure if he should be angry or relieved that Uraraka had asked for a delay in patrolling until the end of the week. She'd only been back at work for a day and a half, and he could hardly stand to look at her anymore. Now, they were expected to work together? Impossible. She hadn't spoken to him once since the night at her apartment, and he didn't know what to make of it. The frustration only aggravated itself whenever he caught her looking his way. The tension endlessly compounded due to the fact that she was only a few doors down the hallway. Arg, he grunted as he tried to focus himself on the Viper case file. He'd spent the entire afternoon that he normally would have used for patrol to study the file and hope for a lead to pop out at him. It was a meager attempt to keep his mind busy. He had noticed that the sun was going down until he threw himself back in his chair and let his gaze break away from the copies of Teller's crime scene photos. His shoulders felt tense, and his neck hurt from looking down for hours. His body was tired and sore from the scuffle he had with the villain from yesterday. It had been a shitty week so far, and his mood reflected that as he shut his eyes and ran a hand through his hair, sliding his mask over his head until it came off completely. The office floor had quieted down significantly, signaling to him that he was one of the last day shift heroes left in the building. He glanced at the time on his computer screen before deciding it was time to call it a day. He was too exhausted to try and fit in a workout, so he stood up and decided to go change. The locker room was quiet, and he was glad for it. He couldn't bear to listen to any of the office extras so much as breathe right now. He was annoyed enough already, and he doubted he had the self-control at the moment to ignore them. He quickly changed and stuffed his costume into his duffel bag, not bothering to fold it up first. He glanced around him and huffed irritably when he realized that he left his grenadiers in his office. Fuck. He slung the bag over his shoulder before slamming his locker shut and stalking out of the locker room. He arrived at his office and dumped the bag on his desk before snatching the grenadiers off the ground with a grumbled line of curses. Hey! A soft voice called from behind him, and there was a single-knuckle knock on his open door. He turned sharply, a grenadier in each hand, and glared at the intruder. The fuck do you want? Can we talk? Uraraka's voice was soft, and she looked hesitant as she stood in the doorway, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. He scowled back at her. I'm busy right now, round face. She watched silently as he turned away and began stuffing his grenadiers in his duffel bag. It won't take long. Tisich, he clicked his tongue in disbelief as he began trying to yank the zipper shut, but it wouldn't close over the equipment. That figures. Bakugou, she shook her head and stepped into the small office. We need to get this sorted out if we're going to work together. He turned to glare on her. There's nothing to sort out, at least as far as I'm aware. She paused to let his words sink in, and she sucked in a sharp breath. You're the one who ran out the door after Dash. Uraraka. His tone was laced with warning as he turned his attention back to the zipper. I got the message. I'll leave you the fuck alone. Uraraka audibly groaned and turned around. Bakugou, just stop for a second, please. She reached for the handle on the door and pushed it shut so that they were alone into the room. He felt a surge of frustration as he snapped his hands away from the busy work of zipping the duffel bag, and he turned to look at her once the door was shut. Fuck, fine. Let's hear it, round face. She breathed out shakily and shook her head. Why are you so angry right now? We need to talk about this, about us. What about us? He jerked his head with a disbelieving chuckle. There is no us. Uraraka. You made that clear to me. I told you I wasn't going to be your fucking rebound. Uraraka ran a hand over her forehead in frustration. You weren't a rebound, Bakugou. He sneered to himself before he went back to his task. I don't know what else you could fucking call it. He smashed the top grenadier down, and the zipper finally slid shut. I fucking get it, Uraraka. You don't need to explain that shit to me. We'll work together as we have to, but outside of that, stay out of the way. Stop. Uraraka snapped at him sharply when he threw the duffel over his shoulder and began to push past her. Bakugou, stop. He glared down at her as she pressed a hand into his chest and tried to shove him backward, his eyes sparking with anger and his lip twitching. Out of my way. No, she replied firmly and held his glare. Not until you listen to what I have to say. He took a long moment to take a breath and try to calm his nerves. All he wanted to do was take off and forget her. The back and forth between them, the kiss, and the way she looked at him now could all be put behind him with enough time and space. He could go back to the way things were before, and something about that felt comforting. Emotions only clouded his judgment, but he couldn't avoid the fact that she was all he thought about when he wasn't working. The silence lasted longer than he had anticipated before he took a half step back and stared hard at her. You haven't said shit to me. What am I supposed to think? Her face softened as she let her hand fall. I'm just trying to figure everything out, Bakugou. He watched her as she hung her head slightly, and she looked to the side. His charged emotions seemed to simmer, and it fueled a frustration within himself. Then what do you want? I just Uraraka cut herself off and shook her head before starting again. I don't want things to be weird between us. Fucking. Bakugou felt his emotions spike again as he pulled his duffel up his shoulder. Whatever, Uraraka. You want normal? You got it. He nodded at her, throwing his chin up. I'll see you tomorrow. No, she spoke sharply and turned an intense gaze on him. We need to work this out. There's nothing to work out. Bakugou snapped back and shook his head wildly at her. You made yourself clear. I'm confused. She bit back without breaking eye contact. You kissed me, remember? His eyes lit up as her tone raised a few notches. So fucking what? He ran a hand through his hair angrily. I ended it and left. That's the problem, Bakugou. She threw out her hands, and her face lit up as they reached the point of contention. You left. I had to, he remarked harshly. Otherwise this conversation would have been a hell of a lot more annoying. Huh. She chuckled darkly and shook her head again. As if I haven't been through enough, Bakugou. Now this is my fault too. Her broken tone seemed to tame the rage in him a touch as he felt his back relax and he looked at her blankly. That's not what I meant. The duffel bag drooped down his shoulder before his fell to a heap on the floor. She turned her face away, but he knew that she was fighting off tears. Yeah, all right. She turned her gaze back to him, her eyes glassy and pinking. You know, it took me a little bit of time to work out my feelings. I was scared because I was worried that I was leading you on, but... She pursed her lips and softly shook her head. It's fine, Bakugou. Just forget it. She turned silently and reached for the door. Uraraka. Bakugou felt his voice soften significantly as realization dawned on him. Wait. She didn't respond as her fingers touched the door handle, and he felt his heart surge in his chest. Her head was down, and he understood in that brief moment that he'd deflected his emotions on her again. Stop. He gently pressed a palm on the side of her arm. Uraraka. She turned her head sharply, a tear threatening to fall from her eye. It's fine. Let's just pretend that none of this ever happened, okay? It'll make it easier for us both. Damn it. He grit his teeth and took a sharp breath. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean to dash. I get it, she interrupted and sniffed hard, trying hard to fight back her emotions. You don't have to apologize. Just shut up. He retorted more harshly than he intended, and he nearly kicked himself. For one fucking second, okay? Her hand paused on the door handle as she stared over her shoulder at him, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears, and he felt defeated as he looked into them. He noticed that the tip of her nose was reddening with every second, and he knew he had to fix the mess he'd made before it was too late. I want to be angry with you, he started hesitantly, unsure of his tone. I didn't know what the fuck I was doing either. I just know that after everything, I really... He trailed off again, searching for the right thing to say. I like you, she said quickly, never taking her eyes off his. He blinked at her, dumbfounded by her omission. His hand against her shoulder was frozen in place as he processed her words. A lightness took over his body as he was cemented to the spot, unable to find a response. She stared at him as the seconds ticked by, and all he could do was stare. She licked her chapping lips as a tear finally broke and rolled down her cheek. "I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." Words refused to formulate in his drying mouth as he watched her nod at him once before she began to turn away and start to open the door again. When he realized that she was leaving, his body acted without a thought, and he slammed his other hand on the door, pressing it shut again. Fuck words. Uraraka gasped slightly as his hand left her shoulder and pressed itself on the other side of her face, pulling her toward him. By the time their lips met, it was a mix of salty tears and teeth. It was hot, breathy, and unpredictable as her body turned entirely toward him and absorbed him while he pressed her against the door with a dull thud. He heard her sniffle as he kissed her harder, and her hands felt their way up his chest to the back of his neck, yanking him into her. He obliged and let his hands fall to her waist before slowly traveling further up her sides until they were pressed against her rib cage. She grunted softly on his lips as she arched herself into him, and he breathed onto her lips with satisfaction. Breaking the kiss was not an option anymore as they fell further into passion. The urge to consume her seemed to cloud his mind as their touching became more frantic and her fingers yanked on the back of his head, reminding him of their first kiss. This time, he fought against her pull and bit her bottom lip greedily. It earned him a breathy moan that did nothing but spur him further. Uraraka didn't protest as his knee wedged itself between her thighs, banging loudly against the door. She responded by pressing her chest hard into him, each vying for control as their lips moved madly against each other, hard exhales fluttering against their cheeks. He barely noticed that one of her hands had moved to his chin, pressing his face upward playfully, and he growled in recognition. His right hand left her side and found itself on the side of her head, digging into the hair behind her ear to fight off her attempt at control. She sighed against his lips, and he took the advantage to swipe his tongue across her top teeth. However, he was caught off guard when her hands fell to his chest and balled up his shirt in fists, indicating something much more than a heated kiss. He growled reluctantly before pulling his face away. He was panting as he stared down at her, a fresh fire in his eyes. "Uraraka?" Her lips twitched with a grin. "Bakugou." His hand fell away from her face, and they broke apart completely. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before gathering up the duffel bag that had fallen to the ground beside them. He felt a tingle as Uraraka let a simple finger slide up his side, and he stole a glance at the innocent look on her face. When the duffel was slung over his shoulder haphazardly, he stood up straight and turned his full attention on her. "Fuck. I like you too." He reached behind her to grab the door handle. "Let's go." Uraraka barely heard the door slam behind her before Bakugou was on her again. His hands immediately found her waist, yanking her into his chest, before he pressed her back into the granite of his kitchen. She heard his keys clatter as he threw them on the countertop, and she briefly registered how new his apartment smelled. She rolled her head back as his lips traveled down her neck, and her breath came out ragged. She giggled excitedly as his teeth grazed their way up her neck to her ear, and she rolled her head forward again to watch as her fingers pressed into hair. "What are you laughing at?" He grumbled against her cheek before his teeth nipped the corner of her mouth, and she shied away teasingly. "You." She chuckled as she pulled hard on his hair with her left hand, and she kissed his cheek lightly. His hand wrapped around her chin before he jerked her mouth in line with his. "Shut the hell up, round face." His lips pressed against hers hard, and she welcomed it, slanting her jaw open so their tongues could attempt to tease the other. She felt his fingertips playing with the bottom of her pink sweatshirt, and she moaned softly against his lips to signal that he shouldn't stop. His nose tickled hers as tough palms pressed against the skin just above her sweatpants, warming the bare skin under her clothes. She responded by pulling up her right knee to wrap it around the back of his thigh, pulling their bodies together completely. "Fuck!" His teeth caught her bottom lip and slowly released it, relishing her gentle sigh as he rolled his head back with the movement. "You've been driving me crazy." Her eyes opened into seductive slits as she looked back at him, her back slanting backward to lean over his kitchen countertop. "Have I?" Fucking crazy. His tone was hoarse as he slid a hand down the leg she had wrapped around him and hitched itself under her knee. In one swift movement, he picked her up and let her other leg wrap around his waist. He kissed underneath her chin as he turned them toward the back of the apartment, not bothering with the lights as he kicked open his bedroom door and carried her inside. She felt a breath escape her when her back flopped down on the bed and he stood over her, his eyes sparkling in the darkness. The city lights came up through the window and cast a seductive shadow over him while she stretched her arms over her head and felt the soft duvet. "Remember the last time I was here? Didn't I tell you to shut the fuck up?" He replied firmly, but there was a smirk playing on his lips. His knees hit the side of the bed as she sat up and stared up at him, her face a breath away from his abdomen and her legs draped over the edge of the mattress. She smiled at him while he brought a palm to rest gently against the side of her face and tilt her chin up. "I got to sleep in this bed." "A first," he replied quickly. His inflection was deeper as he met her gaze. She slid her hands back over the bedspread, admiring its fluffiness. "Is this another first for you?" He smirked at her through the darkness. "I suppose it is in a way. I've never had a woman sleep in my apartment before you. I guess I'll be sleeping here for a second time," she replied smoothly, her hands slowly sliding up the sides of his legs to his hips, her breath fanning over his covered stomach. He caught her chin in between his fingers. "We'll see about that." His hand released her chin just as quickly to slide down her neck, gently fingering her collarbone under her sweatshirt. She acknowledged with a hum, jerking her head away from his grip before she grabbed two fists of his shirt and pulled him down on the bed with her. His lips found hers quickly as she pulled herself further up on the bed to meet him. He propped himself up on one elbow to allow her some breathing room as his free hand felt down her body until he reached her hip and she jerked into him, a soft moan on her lips. He could feel her hands slide up his back underneath his shirt, tracing the bare muscles until she reached his shoulder blades. It excited him in all the right ways, and he responded by dipping his own hand under her sweatshirt and palming over her abdomen until his fingers slid across the bottom of her bra. He felt his way to her side and she twitched, a giggle on her lips. "Ticklish." He grumbled against her lips before he captured them again, not allowing her to answer. She simply breathed hard against his cheek, indicating a yes, and he followed the line again to receive the same response. Uraraka squirmed under him as she repressed another breathless giggle before she used her wrists to hike up his shirt without moving her hands away from his shoulder blades. She was satisfied by his surprised bite on her bottom lip, so he could release a groan of tension, and his hips pressed into hers, forcing her legs further apart underneath him. "Ah," she breathed, breaking away from his lips as she felt him on top of her, the chill of his belt buckle tickling the slightly exposed area of her skin. She wiggled her way further onto the bed, forcing him to chase her, but she sat up quickly enough to begin pulling the sleeves of her sweatshirt down her arms. By the time she began to pull it over her head, she felt his hands leave her in order to help yank it off of her. Once it was off, she caught his gaze from above her. His eyes held a fire she had never seen before, and it did nothing but get her more excited. She didn't protest as he frowned at her gray V-neck, and he reached to pull it off of her as well. She lifted her arms over her head, allowing it to slide over easily, and she immediately searched his gaze again. He was speechless when he saw her topless. A worn-out baby blue bra kept two tightly pressed breasts in place, and he paused to stare. Shit. The word was barely audible on his lips as he admired her. Uraraka let herself fall back on the bed completely as her fingers went to work on pulling his shirt up his chest to reveal his stomach. She smiled playfully as he barely registered that she was doing it. His arms loosened, but his gaze never left her. By the time it went over his head, he seemed to snap out of his reverie. He fell back over her again, and he seemed lost on her as she let her fingers dance down his bare back. He went to work kissing down her neck, pausing for a few seconds at her collarbones to breathe huskily before moving down the left side of her chest. She moaned softly as his teeth grazed against the edge of her bra, and her fingernails scratched lightly over the tops of shoulders, sliding forward to travel down the front of his chest. He pressed his hips into hers hard now, and she was beginning to feel the tension between them grow stronger. She jerked herself into him and smiled against his lips when he grunted with satisfaction. His right hand fell to her hip and pulled her up to him, allowing her to feel him pressed against her most sensitive area. She could tell by the way he felt that she was doing a good job, and it only spurred her to be more bold. When her fingers found their way to his belt, he groaned against her lips, and she smiled against them. She made quick work of undoing it and unbuttoning his pants, slipping her hand underneath his jeans and sliding it over his hardness. "Shit," he mumbled shakily, breaking the kiss, and his hands shoved themselves between her and the mattress to find the back of her bra. He deftly unlatched it, freeing her chest and allowing him to rip it off her, throwing it to the side of bed. She squeezed him lightly, and he released a terse breath before leaning back to see her in full view, his eyes clouded with desire. "Fuck, uraraka." His voice was deep and gravelly before he shut his eyes, with her next light squeeze and grit his teeth. She smiled to herself as she let her fingers gently glide to the top of his boxers and play with the edge in the most teasing way she knew how. He blinked his eyes open and gave her a lustful look before he fell on her again, his hands sliding up her sides to her bare breasts. He palmed them desperately, his fingers grazing over her nipples, forcing them to perk up in the darkness. "You're fucking beautiful," he murmured as his head fell into the crook of her neck, and he kissed it tenderly. She moaned softly in response before she allowed her fingers to finally reach into his boxers and delicately feel his bare hardness. He tensed over her for a moment, a similar reaction happening in her hand, before he relaxed and began to kiss down her chest, sliding himself out of her grip. He moved slowly, letting his lips leave a light trail between her breasts and down her stomach. It was her turn to shut her eyes, feeling the intimacy of his movements, before his hot breath hovered over the ties of her sweatpants. He kissed across the top of her pelvis before his hands slid up her legs and 2 index fingers hooked around the waistband on either side. She forced her eyes open and looked down her body. He blinked at her once. A lustful shine in his red eyes almost made them look like they could glow. His mouth was relaxed, and his hair was already showing signs of bedhead from her pulling it. It was the sexiest thing she had ever seen. He pulled the sweatpants and her underwear off in one fluid movement, dragging them down her legs without breaking eye contact. She heard them hit the floor, but she was focused on him as he stood up from the bed and gazed down at her naked body. He licked his lips and shook his head in disbelief, his hand raking itself through his hair. Uraraka just lay still on the bed, letting him admire her. She let her eyes fall down his chest to see a few faint scars along the right side of his ribcage. He was in amazing shape, but she had envisioned it enough times over the last few months that she wasn't surprised. Toned muscles lined his hips and vertically up his stomach. His chest was flat and firm, making her slowly bite her bottom lip. His jeans were hanging loosely from his hips, already undone and wanting to slide down his legs. His dark blue boxers were visible above the waistline. "You are," he breathed and let his eyes lazily drag back up her body before resting on her face. He couldn't finish the thought as the words escaped him. "Wow." She smiled shyly at him and ran her hands down the duvet on either side of her. "I know how you feel." She slowly pushed her shoulders forward, forcing her chest to tighten up. He didn't say another word as he began to kick his jeans off his legs without looking away from her body. His hands went to his waist and pushed the boxers down as well, joining her in her nakedness. The darkness of the room didn't allow her to see much more before he fell back down on the bed with her. His lips found hers again, but these kisses weren't as tender. They were hot and urgent. Their hands were everywhere, teasing and playful. Uraraka couldn't stop her short gasp when his fingers slid over her mound before vanishing again. He grinned on her lips before capturing them again and letting his hand tease her a few more times. She loved the surprise touches, but soon she wanted to match him. Her fingers left his back and slid between them, finding his hardness and wrapping her hand around it. He grunted audibly as she slowly began to slide her palm up and down it. His hands forgot what they were doing, and his right fist wrapped itself tightly in the duvet as he breathed hard against her cheek. "Fuck," he grumbled to himself before he used his knees to spread her legs out beneath him. He pulled away quickly and sat up on his knees. He pumped himself slowly for a moment and reached a hand down to her most sensitive place to gauge her wetness. He was pleasantly surprised by what he found, and she smiled wryly at him, her hips wiggling in response to his touch. Without a word, he planted his left palm by her head and used his right hand to guide himself between her legs. He looked back at her when his tip brushed her wetness, and his eyes seemed to ask for permission. Uraraka whined a moan as she lifted her hands to the sides of his face and pulled him down. He slowly leaned into her as his cock began to push past her entrance. By the time he was kissing her again, he was fully inside. He groaned loudly on her lips, and she matched it, feeling how he seemed to fit inside comfortably. He pulled his hips back slowly as he savored the feeling before pushing in again with the same speed. Her soft moans at his pace drove him mad. It felt amazing as his hands began to slide up and down the sides of her body. The soft skin under his calloused palms felt incredible. He painstakingly picked up the pace, wanting to hear more of her short moans and lose control of himself. Uraraka felt herself slipping into complete lust as she felt Bakugou's weight on top of her, and she could feel the muscles in his back flex with every thrust. He broke the kiss and panted against her cheek before he let his head fall between her shoulder and her neck. His skin was hot, and his coarse hair tickled her skin as his palms slid down her body to grab her hips. NGH. Uraraka squeezed her eyes shut as a feeling of euphoria began to build within her, her mind fuzzing more with each second. Her moans came out strangled as he picked up speed, and he grunted into her shoulder. His breath felt sticky and sensual. She felt herself tightening around him as his thrusts became more sporadic. Fuck, he breathed hard as his pace slowed again, fighting off the urge to orgasm too early. He could feel how tight she'd become, and it was sending his head into a fit of pleasure. Don't stop. Uraraka's voice was small as she scraped her fingers down his back, tracing the lines of his shoulders. Please. It was all he needed to hear before he started pumping into her with a new intensity. Pleasing her was the ultimate goal, and he could tell by the way her body responded to his that he was succeeding. Her legs lifted to help reach a better angle, and she pulled him closer, pressing her chest against his. His hands gripped her hips hard, and he heaved himself against her, trying to get her there. Ack. Uraraka's voice cracked as she tightened hard around him, her chest pressing hard into him as her head threw itself into the cool duvet. Her fingernails clamped into the skin of his back as she slipped into the throes of bliss. Her face was contorted with pleasure, and he pulled his head back to see it. The way her teeth clenched and her body convulsed under him was purely erotic, sending his mind into a frenzy. Foo dash, he couldn't finish the word as he pulled himself out of her and used a hand to pump his cock, finishing on her stomach. His shoulders lurched forward as his entire body tensed, and his brain seemed to shut off as he rode out the high. HGHN, Uraraka whimpered as she writhed below him, her eyes blinking open to see him. Minutes passed in silence as the pair drifted back to reality. His arms shook under the weight of his body, and he finally tore his gaze away to flop down on the mattress beside her, rolling on his back. A contented sigh passed his lips as he looked up at the ceiling. Uraraka turned her head to see his side profile. He looked relaxed as he rested, and she couldn't help but feel satisfied when she watched his eyes flutter closed. The silence was comforting as they caught their breath, but it didn't stop her from trailing her fingertips over his forearm. Even in the darkness, she could see a small smile twitching on his lips. Bakugou felt exhausted as the cool air of the apartment helped his heart rate slow. In the long moments of silence, he could hear her breathing and the feeling of her fingernails dragging down his arm with a tickling sensation. As his eyes fell shut, he savored in the sounds. For the first time, his apartment didn't feel silent and empty. So that's it for today. If you liked the video, leave a like, subscribe, and activate the notification bell. And if you want to contribute to the entire story being illustrated, just read the information in the description below.